Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is the 6th episode in the series, Better Learning. In this episode, Dr. Scoresby will explain how to help your students master a new method of symbolic learning that is fun and creative and improves memory. This method can help learners retain large quantities of information and process it effectively.
The profession of teaching has come a long ways in the last 2 decades. In fact, some of the most remarkable teaching methods that have ever been invented have shown up during that period of time. One of these areas of emphasis is called brain-based teaching, where the teachers are able to know more about how the brain learns, and then they can incorporate it into the methods they use to teach. As it turns out, students tend to be very interested in the operations of the brain, and quite often they become self-motivated to learn and to do homework simply because they want to watch and see how their brain functions. One of the students that I became aware of said, "Wow, it's all about how you think, isn't it?" Which at the time I thought, gee, that's a sort of a remarkable grasp of the obvious. But as it turns out, he was right. It is how you think, and it's learning to pay attention to your thought processes and how your brain works that enables you to learn in your own method. In this episode, I am going to introduce something which may be familiar to you. It was new to me when I learned it. It is called mind mapping, or using symbols. And while the name might be new, the method of using it will become so interesting and familiar to you that you'll be able to implement it easily. At birth, the human brain has many more neurons, that is, cells, than it is going to need to be fully organized. Normal infants are born prepared to cope with early injury and development, which will take place in the next 15 to 20 years, if it happens at all, an injury that is. One part of this development is the formation of connections between cells. The more elaborate systems of connections make more effective and intelligent brains. Those involved with this movement have sort of an inside joke where now they say if somebody calls you dense, thank them, because dense brain cells is a sign of intelligence. Now, these connections are formed as a natural part of development and can be seen in the brain's ability to move from simple to more complex function as it matures. In addition, medical scientists believe that stimulation and activity promote brain development not just through childhood and adolescence, but also throughout life, which is really a remarkable discovery. The process of aging in people over 65, for instance, accelerates when mental activity is reduced by disengaging from the environment. In the ordinary course of development, the increased complexity of connections makes it possible for the brain to work faster and complete more complex tasks. For instance, the brain develops symbol systems because it is faster to think in symbols than in separate or isolated bits of information. Jerome Bruner, a developmental psychologist, described the initial part of this process as representational thought, or how the brain represents internally what exists externally. Enactive, E-N-A-C-T-I-V-E, an active representation, children's first representations of external objects as people, demonstrated in body imitation where they act out what they see. So this representation means that children imitate what they see. Then there's something called iconic representation, and this is the appearance of the ability to visualize an image. I can sort of see it in my mind. And then the third type of representation is symbolic representation. A single mental event represents or symbolizes a much more complex and abstract set of ideas, activities, or other mental operations. A word, for example, is a symbol. Our spoken and written language is a symbol system because each word represents some external information, that is, an object or objects. Other familiar examples or symbols or symbol systems include math symbols, where a single symbol, plus, minus, divide, and so on, represents a more complex multi-step process. Other examples of symbols include religious or civil ceremonies, statues, and memorials. The use of symbols is the brain's way of accelerating its abilities. This is a natural process coincident with maturation. Similar to other mental skills, there are many individual differences, though, which you should be reminded of. Some students have an easier affinity with symbols, while others are more likely to have difficulty. And, like many other mental abilities, every student can enhance his or her ability with training, which is a remarkable thing, actually. Children are ready to use symbols in learning, however, which we should not forget, either as a parent or as a teacher. Until recently, most psychologists took the perspective of famous child development research Piaget that children begin to use symbolic representations only when they reach approximately 18 to 24 months of age and can interact with the outside world through actions, physical movement, imitating, or play imagining with objects. In recent years, however, considerable evidence has surfaced that even small infants have the rudimentary skills for symbolic understanding, and that in the first few years of life, symbolic understanding develops much more rapidly than previously thought. The implication is that it is human nature to seek for and use symbolic representations in our cognitive processes. So what does this mean? Well, it means likely that we should be preparing our children from infancy. Even the newest infants can integrate information from different physical senses into a single representation. A cognitive behavior sometimes referred to as intermodal mapping, which facilitates the multidimensional nature of symbolic thought, just means using hearing and visualization to come up with the same idea. Two examples illustrate how babies integrate this. First, infants only 2 to 21 days old are already capable of inactive, that is, bodily imitation, representation, mentioned earlier, which Bruner said was the first stage of symbolic thought. In contrast with Piaget's original assumption that children could not imitate facial expressions until 12 months of age, their researchers have found that infants demonstrate facial imitation 2 to 21 days old, and who open and close their mouths or stick out their tongues after seeing the same thing done by an adult. Second, 4-month-old infants can appropriately match sounds with visual displays, as in an experiment in which children were shown movies on 2 screens. One screen showed a woman playing peekaboo, the other showed a hand drumming. A soundtrack was played for only one of the displays, and the infants spent more time watching the appropriate visual display. Now think of that. That means at a very early age, the human brain, infants, are using symbols to think. Now, besides being able to integrate multisensory information by 4 months of age, infants already have a grasp on the reality of the permanence or tangible physical objects. They show surprise through heart rate and extended staring when researchers manipulate objects to show an impossible event, such as one object passing through another one without collision. This understanding of object permanence, it's called, apparently extends early on to an infant's understanding of basic number concepts, which is in itself a building block of symbolic thought. 5-month-old babies were shown a toy which was then hidden by a screen, and then saw experimenters placing another toy behind the screen before lowering the screen. The babies demonstrated a rudimentary understanding of number concepts because they did not stare unusually long when the 2 toys appeared together as they expected. Indeed, in cases where the lowered screen revealed only 1 toy instead of the expected 2, infants stared much longer, presumably in surprise over the unexpected outcome. Babies were also shown more than 1 car and stared in surprise when a removed screen showed more than the single toy they expected to remain. In fact, they stared approximately the same number of times as the number of toys. Well, what about children's early symbolic use? Judy Ledoch and her colleagues have shown that 2 to 3-year-old children understand that one thing can represent another. In Deloach's experiments, children were asked to find a toy in a room. First, however, they were shown a representation of both the toy and the room, either in the form of pictures or in the form of a miniature model. For example, if the real toy were hidden under the desk in the room, then children would be shown either a picture of the toy under a desk or a miniature replica of the toy placed in a scale model of the room. Now, upon being shown in the hidden location, either with the photo or miniature toy, 3-year-olds successfully use the representation to find the real hidden toy. This capacity is the forerunner of more complex cognitive ability to recognize and create symbolic representations in such things as maps and art. The 2.5-year-olds demonstrated a developing capacity for, although they could not successfully use a scale model to find the real toy, they did recognize and utilize the photo of the toy to find the real one. Children's natural and early symbolic capacity develops even long before we are taught reading, writing, and outlining skills, and therefore can be a valuable tool, especially for students who may still favor early developed visual and symbolic skills over school-trained linear and analytic ones. For a long time, psychologists believed that we thought in linear patterns, that our thoughts moved in an orderly progression from A to B to C. And they believed this because most of our recorded thoughts followed this fashion. Words are spoken one at a time in a logical sentence, and we write usually in straight lines, either left to right, right to left, or up to down, and so on. Because language and writing appeared to follow a straight sequence, they assumed that we must and should think in the same way. Schools then idealized this sort of straight linear thought by teaching us that the best way to mentally digest new information would be to organize it into an outline, a series of Roman numerals, headings, subheadings, and so forth. Well, the problem with this traditional method, though undoubtedly useful for many specific tasks, is that most of us don't think that way naturally. In fact, rather than following a laid out thought pattern, the brain most often works primarily with associated concepts clustered together in an interlinked, integrated manner. I'm going to repeat that. The brain most often works primarily with associated thoughts, things which are clustered together in an interlinked, integrated manner. So, for example, if you were going to teach, you would put things together and say, look at all these things, they occur together, and the children would be better able to learn and remember them. Neural networks are complex and circuitous. We tend to think in flashes of visual images and quick related clusters of ideas that our brain has stored all together as potentially relevant to one another. Hence, if we limit our note-taking and brainstorming to a linear outline form, we fail to take advantage of the brain's marvelous capacity to create neural networks of loosely associated items. When we access this mental capacity, our creative output will be greater. And also, when we turn abstract ideas into visual representations, the result can be truly magical. That is, when we see something and then attempt to draw it, or see something and want to reproduce it. This happens because more space in our brains is devoted to the visual sense than to any other. Now I'm going to introduce you to mind mapping, which is the use of symbols to enhance learning. Mind mapping is a learning and retention strategy that utilizes the brain's natural ability with symbols. In addition, it is a technique which integrates many parts of the brain's operation while helping students organize large quantities of information. In that sense, it is a powerful learning technique as well as an activity which promotes cognitive growth. Most students learn by one basic way of organizing and thinking about information. It's called the outline. Students usually use outlines to take notes, to organize a research paper, to understand a textbook chapter, and to think in a logical, sequential manner. This method works well for some students, that is, left brain, verbal, linguistic, logical, mathematical students, but not for many others. Mind mapping is a technique for organizing information that uses both sides of the brain. It invites use of all learning modalities and employs more of the multiple intelligences. Mind mapping encourages students to use symbols. In the case of mind mapping, symbols require the brain to integrate other information such as a visual image, an emotional response, and written words. Integrating these into a symbol system stimulates the brain to use higher level functions. And for this reason, mental abilities are improved through use of mind mapping systems. Students who learn to use the mind mapping technique can benefit by having an alternative to outlining. For certain students, a mind map will work for better than outline. Students may be more interested in using it because it is creative and unusual. So here's how students can create a mind map instead of an outline to represent concepts. Start with a large sheet of paper laid lengthwise and a lot of colored markers. In the center of the page, choose a visual way to represent the main idea or topic you want to display. Have fun with the colors. Most ideas can be represented by simple and fun pictures or images, but when specific names or words are needed, a single word may be placed alongside the image. In other words, on this page, laid down lengthwise, the center of it is the central theme of the thing you're going to read. Next, branching out from the central topic, draw connecting lines and then start smaller representations to show whatever free associations your mind makes when thinking about the central topic. In this way, subtopics, side points, or surrounding issues will be simply and visually connected to the center and perhaps to each other in meaningful and memorable ways. When needed, write a few meaningful keywords on attached branches. There are no concrete rules about mind mapping, so experiment with ways to show relationships between concepts and images. Mind maps show clearly the main topic, which is always in the center. Maps reinforce the relative importance of subordinate ideas and tangents. Key links between concepts can be immediately recognized by proximity and connection. Always easy to add new information. Different topics will have entirely dissimilar maps, which will aid students in recalling a specific lesson or topic. In more creative areas of note-taking, like, say, essay preparation, the open-ended nature of the map enables the brain to form connections more rapidly. Mind maps use the whole brain, not just the left side, and many children will find working with images and colors more fun. Best of all, making a mind map helps students organize large quantities of information for better retention and better achievement. Now think about this. What we're going to do is to read something, and while we're reading it, we're going to make a visual representation of it on this sheet of paper. And the symbols that are on that page will represent things that the student has read. So when they're reviewing or preparing to take a test, for example, or write a paper, they can look at this map and it can remind them of all these important connections. Now, if the mind map helps a student be more successful with something, then the resulting success may change his or her beliefs by increasing optimism and confidence, which I have personally seen on many occasions. Sometimes just one successful experience can change a student's opinion about his or her learning abilities and make them feel more confident. Mind mapping gives parents and teachers an alternate way to help students retain information while helping them apply the concept of symbols. Some students who cannot otherwise recall sufficient information, that is, they don't have as good a memory as others, especially where reading comprehension, for example, they'll be successful with mind mapping, and mind mapping will increase their ability to read and process the information they read. Mind mapping gives information an additional tool to add variety to their instruction and more adequately respond to a student who may have difficulty learning. If you wish to know more about mind mapping and to see some specific activities you can do with your children or your students, then please go to firstanswers.com on the home page and find the book Awakening the Brain's Potential, and there's a section in that book on mind mapping.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit firstanswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.